Hello, good morning in New York, good midday in Europe, and good evening, early evening in Beirut and the Middle East. Welcome. I'm Rami Khouri, the director of the Global Engagement Initiative at the American University of Beirut, based at the Deb Center, the New York City office of AUB. And I'm delighted to moderate this session. I'm going to turn it over to Joe Bahout, the director of the Essam Faris Institute, and Joe is going to say a few welcoming words.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I just wanted to say a few words to put this in the general framework we are starting to work on at IFI. We are about to launch much more international affairs activities and events, and the idea is that IFI at AUB should not only talk about the Middle East or for the Middle East, but it should also talk about global affairs and be able to reach a wider audience than only the Lebanese or Arab audience. So it was all the more natural that we take benefit of the approach of the American elections to start this kind of reflection on global issues, on international issues. And we had the tremendous luck of having our good friends, former director of IFI, Rami Khouri at New York. And with him, we have put up this, I think, interesting series of webinars. The first one is today. It's mainly focused on the race, on the electoral race, the state of the opinion and American politics. And the next one will follow the results of the election. It will be mainly focused on what to expect from the next administration towards the several issues and stakes in the Middle East. So I leave it to Rami. I know that he's doing a fantastic job in moderating this and other sessions, and I'll be very happy to see you again in other events when we have the opportunity to do so. I wish everyone 1 hour and a half of thrilling insights and information about the US elections. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to Suzanne and Ryan and all the other people at Essam Faris Institute at AUB for putting this together. This is a session entitled The Shifting Trends in Demographics in the United States Presidential Election. We chose that theme to go beneath the surface a little bit and to look at what's happening sociologically, ideologically, politically, in the United States across different demographic groups, particularly ones that have an interest in or Middle East, like Americans or Muslim Americans, but also looking at African Americans, Hispanic, suburban voters, white women, college educated or high school educated men, whatever, the various groups. And we have 3 speakers today who will give us the insights from their research. So this is the kind of seminar that we like to do at IFI and AUB and in the Global Engagement Program to draw on research to analyze the realities of our world. And then we can throw in a few comments and analysis here and there, but research knowledge is really the core of what we try to disseminate. This seminar is co-hosted by the Essam Faris Institute, the Center for American Studies and Research at AUB, and the Global Engagement Program, the Global Engagement Initiative at the Deb Center in New York City. So with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Shibli Telhami, who has been doing polling and analysis and political research and commentary for decades. He's a professor at the University of Maryland, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and Center for Middle East Policy, and a highly respected American political scientist. So Shibli, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. It's a pleasure for me to appear on this panel, and thank you, Rami, for organizing it. And congratulations to AUB for persuading you to stay in some capacity. You're one of a kind, so I'm really pleased to join you. Let me start with some broad remarks about where we are in the American election process. Obviously, elections will be held on November 3rd, but what is the picture? What does it look like based on really dozens and dozens of polls so far, including my own? I direct the University of Maryland's Critical Issues poll, and we do conduct polling on elections We're about to release a new study next week analyzing the demographics of the American election. But I want to start by with the question of what is this election about? I mean, I think tonight we're going to see a debate that is focused on foreign policy. Does it really matter? Well, I think based on what we have seen, this really isn't even about issues, let alone foreign policy issues. With regard to the priorities, this is really an election like no other we have seen. It's about what America is about. It's a values election. It's an election about many people feel about in a way saving the American democracy. It's about protecting the American institutions. It's far more important than any specific issue. And we see that it's not even partisan. Typically, America has been partisan election time, particularly between Republican and Democrat, that it is this time as well. But it's much bigger than that. It is really about Trump and what he stands for and all people who oppose him. That's what it's about. In fact, in one of the polls I have did recently, we asked people, what is most important in deciding to vote? Is it the Supreme Court, which, as you know, in and of itself is extremely important issue, still is, and now it's even more important with the process that's going on to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. I think it's if you evaluate that and then also evaluate the option of party loyalty, agreeing with the candidate, or being for Trump or against Trump, the overwhelming majority of voters, both Republican and Democrats, say it's either for Trump or against Trump. The Supreme Court, in comparison, gets less than 10% of people who say I'm voting principally based on the Supreme Court, because yeah, it's important, but there's something bigger here that's going on. And I say that because I think we have to understand that issues, of course, matter in defining the candidates themselves, but by now people have made up their mind. You either embrace Trump or you don't embrace Trump. And what we're likely to see tonight on the foreign policy debate, of course they'll disagree, but most people, frankly, have made up their minds already. It would not move the needle. And the issues that they'll be discussing will be important only insofar as energizing the base or defining the characters of candidates or scoring points, but not really evaluating substantively any issue of foreign policy, including the Middle East, which is likely to come up. And it's likely to come up, of course, because Trump is now trying to sell himself as the very effective diplomat, very effective peacemakers. He's selling the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem as a success, the deals between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain as something that he has succeeded in doing. Perhaps he's rushing to get an agreement with the Sudan. He might even announce it tonight because they're that close to it, to take credit as a peacemaker. But frankly, it will move the needle zero. It will have no impact. It's not going to work. It might, work with his base, but it wouldn't work beyond. And frankly, I believe on this particular issue, Trump himself probably have been told by his assistants, like Jared Kushner, that this could help him in the election, sell him as a leader, as a successful foreign policy leader. But frankly, that's not why they're doing it. That's not what Kushner is doing. They're trying to pack as many deals between Israel and the Arab state as they can before the end of the administration. But they use that as a mechanism to persuade the president. And the president, as you could see from all the reports of his aides, really doesn't follow issues very well. He has, very little, information about the world and doesn't even read intelligence reports. And by the way, this is not just the public stuff. I'm co-authoring a book about the Trump and Obama presidencies. We interviewed many of Trump's top advisors, and the picture that emerges is a president who's not particularly engaged, and therefore he's not the one who's making these core policies. So keep that in mind as you follow the debates tonight. But let's just talk about where Biden and Trump are, and what are the prospects that they would that either would win. First of all, the picture looks really strong for Biden. You have, for one thing, Biden's favorability ratings are very high, more than 50%, above 50%, compared much more than Trump. In our polling, Democrats are far more motivated to vote than Republicans. They're both motivated, but Democrats are more motivated. And what's interesting, I think, what you see in the conversation, something that I think is, it doesn't capture it. There's a lot of people who say, well, Democrats are not enthusiastic about Biden. And therefore, they're not as energized as Republicans, because Republicans are more energized. Trump supporters are more enthusiastic about their candidate. That up to a point is true, by the way, but wouldn't matter. And let me tell you why, because as I said, when you ask Democrats and Republicans if they're more motivated to vote, more Democrats say they're motivated to vote. The reason for that is that the Democrats, yes, are mostly motivated by anti-Trump, and they like Biden well enough. I mean, keep in mind, it's not that they dislike Biden. Biden has more favorability ratings than Trump, and he has had, and certainly more than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. So that is a sufficient energizer right now, as undoubtedly, and we could see it not in the public opinion polls, but look, the energetic pre-election voting. So far, we have millions that have voted. I don't know what the last number is. Probably over 20 million people have already voted, including me, by the way, and my family. I mean, people are energized to vote. In fact, I would say, I would go a little bit further. I would say that if it weren't for the 2016 experience, and by the 2016 experience, I mean, if it weren't for the fact that in 2016, Hillary Clinton was favored to win by far, and then she lost, people now wouldn't even be taking this race seriously anymore. It would be, you look at the objective numbers and you would say, oh, come on, there's no way Trump would pull it off. And the only thing that's keeping us busy and engaged is that lingering fear saying, it could happen again, it could happen again. And therefore, by the way, that is leading to kind of more energizing of the Democrats, because last time there was a little complacency in 2016, and also complacency among Sanders supporters who sat out because they weren't enthusiastic about Hillary Clinton. That's not likely to, because that lingering fear from 2016 is an internalized message that is taking place right now that is adding to a different kind of sentiment. So what is the objective picture in terms of the results right now? Well, if you look at the average polls, Biden is leading by about 10 percentage points nationally. And that is much bigger than the lead that Hillary Clinton had, which was roughly around 6%. And by the way, she dropped to less than 1% before the election. Just to be fair, to think about this, the national elections in 2016 were not all that far off, because she had dropped low, and ultimately she won the national vote, as you know, by more than 2 percentage points. So it was the states where she lost by 78,000 votes that made the difference, and that's where the polling was incorrect. So first of all, Biden is leading bigger than Hillary Clinton. Number two, he's leading in the swing states. In some cases by huge margins, like Pennsylvania, which he lost last time, is the latest poll. He's leading by double digit in Pennsylvania yesterday, released by CNN. He is slightly leading in Florida, which is obviously critical. There are states that you never would have thought are in play that look like they could be in play, like Texas. Long shot, but even the fact that people are talking about it is different. So all these objective factors are there, and yet there's this lingering fear. Let me tell you why the lingering fear is probably not justified. Probably not justified. Number one, as I said earlier, the gap between the candidates is bigger than before. Number two, Biden's favorability is much higher than Hillary Clinton's. She's over 50%. By the way, she was even behind Trump in favorability. She had 46% last time. Biden gets over 50% support in the national polls, in some cases 54%. And Hillary Clinton never got up to 50% in the polling, even when she was leading by a large number over Trump. And that's critical because obviously those are votes that Trump would have to peel off from Biden in the next couple of weeks before the election. There's a lot of demographics that supported Trump last time that are not supporting him now. Older people is really kind of one of the places where it's fascinating how much of a shift there is. Suburban housewives that Trump is trying to fight for, he's pretty much lost them. Lessons that we have learned from state polling. Last time, one reason why polling in state by state was somewhat inaccurate was the fact that, underestimated the views of people who have lower education, rural areas that are very difficult to sample. People don't even participate often in the polling. There's been improvement in measuring the polls that lessons based on 2016. I think you add to this the fact that people have already made up their mind. The number of undecideds is so much smaller than it was in 2016. People have already voted. I think the fact those things mean that it's really kind of a foregone conclusion. That's why you can see the betting odds in some cases have Biden winning with nearly 90% odds. But let me just end by saying, of course, there are always surprises, and everybody has to be mindful of that, and also the worry about complacency, which I'm not worried about at this point. But I think that the fact that they, could be some events that were not anticipated, surprises. October is passing very quickly, though. Usually you talk about the October surprise. Apparently, the president was mostly hoping the Justice Department would take action against his opponent and President Obama, which hasn't taken place. But let me tell you about my worries as we end. One is voter suppression. Voter suppression is real, and that's an issue that is big, both in terms of making it harder, particularly for lower income and African Americans, Hispanic Americans, new immigrants, more difficult to vote by kind of complicating the process, or by having fewer polling stations to have them wait for hours, or tighten the rules in a way that would render many of their votes, even if they vote, render those votes not counting. So that's a real issue. We've seen it in places like Georgia. It may have impacted the governor's race, and we have to be mindful of that. Foreign intervention is a serious issue. 2 days ago, I hosted Fiona Hill, my colleague at Brookings, who had testified on the impeachment issue on Russian intervention. And she said, it's so easy now to do. Other nations are doing it. Whether or not that is going to have a particular impact, we don't really know. We are obviously worried also about delays in counting. Part of the problem is that the scenario, nightmare scenario that we are all facing, is that because most of the people who have voted and are voting by mail are Democrats, they're energized, and also obviously the president has tried to legitimize mail voting. Some of those are not going to be counted on election day or by election day. It may take days after election. So what does that mean? It means that it is likely that people who are actually going to be voting on election day are going to be mostly Republicans. And the first counts that you're going to see on television screens appearing early in the evening after the election may look like they're favoring Trump by virtue of that dynamic, even though that's going to be a small sample. And it's possible, and Bernie Sanders has talked about this as a nightmare scenario of the president going based on the votes that are being counted on the day of election. It looks like he's leading. He'll declare victory before the end of the day, and then he'll start delegitimizing the mail-in votes that are coming in and being counted in the next days. And we have a crisis on our hand that we're going to have to contend with. That's a real possibility. And that's why I think that the Democrats, and I shouldn't say the Democrats, all those who oppose Trump, because as you know, there's been a lot of people, including the Republicans, who abandoned the Republican Party and the president because they think democracy is at stake. Many of them say, you've got to vote like your life depends on it, because the numbers have to be so overwhelming that it is impossible for the president to challenge it, but that remains a real worry. I'll end with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Shibli. Amazing. You took 19 minutes. You've obviously done this before. Thank you. With a lot of questions that I have and others will have, we'll get to them in the question answer period. So I'd like to ask Mustafa Bayoumi to get his set, and go ahead. You have 15 minutes, please. Tfaddal.
Thank you.
Go ahead, yes.
Thank you, Rami. And thank you to all my panelists and to IFI and the kind invitation to have me here today. It's really an important election. Obviously, as Shibli was just saying, I think that's much of what he says. I completely agree with this. Is really a values election. And I'm going to focus my comments today mostly on Muslim Americans and a little bit on foreign policy at the end as well. I'll talk a little bit also about Arab Americans. But, you know, I think it's important to understand the ways in which Muslim Americans have resonated within the American political scene over the recent years and recent elections. For example, Trump really began his presidential run back in 2015 running on an anti-Muslim and anti-Mexican platform. Perhaps two of his most famous positions in the 2016 campaign were, of course, the build the wall issue and demanding a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country. So it's anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican. And then, of course, by January 27 of 2017, one of the first things that he did when in office was the first iteration of the Muslim ban, of the travel ban. That it took several times for them to get it right. I mean, it's not right, obviously, but for the Supreme Court then ultimately to rule that this could be constitutional, which is, again, completely damaging, in my opinion, to the democratic health of this country. And what that also meant was that in the lead up to the election and after, there were levels of violence against Muslim Americans in this country that were matched only by the period immediately following 9/11. We had a very, very dangerous time in 2015, 2016, 2017. So I think, you could be forgiven for thinking that Islamophobia would remain one of the sharpest knives in the campaign drawer of the Trump administration. But that's not exactly what happened. While Islamophobia has remained constant over these 4 years, the division and the violence and the hatreds emanating out of the White House has actually it's just morphed, it's expanded to all sorts of other groups, to Jewish Americans, Black Americans, to asylum seekers, to AOC, to the Squad, etc. And I think what this has meant is that Trump has been less reliant on invoking and provoking Islamophobia specifically for political gain during the time that he's been in office. Again, this is not to say that he hasn't done it. His primary target these days is Congresswoman Ilhan Omar when talking about Islamophobia. But what I'm saying is that Islamophobia is not uniquely or almost uniquely at the center of the campaign as it was in 2016. course, Islamophobia is still really operative within several Republicans running for Congress, including Laura Loomer, a self-styled proud Islamophobe who has been banned from social media for her hate speech, and she's running in Florida. And there's Marjorie Taylor Greene, a QAnon supporter and congressional candidate in Georgia, who has also spouted many anti-Muslim as well as anti-Jewish things. And her QAnon affiliation is important to underscore as well. You know, according to one recent poll, a full 50% of Trump supporters believe that Democrats are involved in elite child trafficking rings, which is a central QAnon belief. In other words, the Republican Party seems to be just getting more and more bizarre by the minute. And as it gets more bizarre, the Democrats, I think it's fair to say, have been training their focus on the moderate swing voter Republicans. And the results have produced something sometimes that is even more bizarre. For example, there was a curious absence of Muslim speakers at the Democratic and not the Republican convention this year. There were probably more Muslim speakers visible at the Republican convention, not speakers, but there were probably more Muslims visible at the Republican convention than there were at the Democratic one. Republican convention, they were the ones who were getting their citizenship papers handed to them by the great leader in a staged ceremony that they actually knew nothing about. I don't know if people remember that during the Republican convention, but 5 got citizenship, and that included a Sudanese teacher, a chef from Ghana, and a woman from Lebanon. At the Democratic convention, we saw something different. There were no Muslim speakers this year. There were very few Latino or Latina speakers. There was much more targeted campaigning trying to convince possible swing voters to vote for Biden. So at least for one brief, Republicans co-opted the image of the Muslim American voter. Compare this to recent electoral history, and I think it gets even more interesting. You know, if we go back to the Obama campaign of 2008, what did we see then? We saw Obama's campaign rushing 2 women out of camera view because they were wearing hijab when he was in Michigan campaign rally, and the campaign was very scared of its affiliation with Muslim voters. I'm sure people recall that moment. The optics were about denying visibility to Muslims in the Democratic Party during much of the period of the Obama years. That changed when Trump began running for president and when he was instrumentalizing his anti-Muslim bigotry to such a massive political degree. Only then did Barack Obama visit a mosque in the United States. That was on February 4th of 2016. So there was this invisibility of Muslims during much of the Obama years. And then, of course, when Trump became so anti-Muslim during Hillary Clinton's campaign, we had the powerful use of Khizr Khan, who had lost his son in Iraq during the campaign convention. And in 2016, images of Muslims, at least, were everywhere within the Democratic Party. Actual Muslims were still kept somewhat at arm's length, of course. But by 2020, the Democrats seem to have returned again to the invisible Muslim, based at least on the convention. The Republicans' use of the Muslim, even within the convention, or even during the convention too, there was a lot of Republican promotion of Black and Indigenous people. There was a seeming embrace of multiculturalism. There was a lot of that during the Republican convention, but all of it should, in my opinion, not be taken seriously. And bear with me for 1 second while I explain why. The Republican convention was, on the face of it, a display of GOP empathy and multiculturalism. This is now part of the Republican playbook, but make no mistake, the right, especially the far right, is very good at using irony. Not funny irony, but postmodern political irony. To the general viewer, such displays by the Republicans may look authentic, but the far right considers authenticity to be the foolish domain, really, of normies, of normal people. The far right looks at every political message as a tool of simultaneous recruit and disavowal. So it's worth thinking about the way that Trump and his Republican messaging use that through the lens of alt-right irony. Normies may see authenticity, but the far right sees naked self-interest instead. And so, I don't think we should take the Republicans at their word. In other words, when they have in those few moments when they are also including Muslim Americans in their playbook, and most Muslim Americans haven't been fooled either. This I'm going to read now from a very recent survey released by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. They did a survey between March and April, and they found that that as in the case in 2016 and 2020, American Muslims prefer a Democrat over a Republican for president. 51% selected a Democrat as a candidate for choice, and 16% chose a Republican. Muslims, 28%, are more likely than the general public, which is at 19%, to be undecided with respect to presidential vote choice. During the primary season, Muslims split their support among Democratic candidates. 29% report supporting Bernie Sanders and 22% Joe Biden. Among Muslims, 14% selected Trump as their candidate of choice in 2020, compared with 4% in 2016. So Trump's support went up from 4% to 14%. Again, we find the relatively higher percentage in favor of Trump as the next president may be driven by the 31% of white Muslims who chose Trump, compared with 6 to 8% of non-white Muslims. So the white Muslim electorate is the one that's actually driving up, and that follows in line with the general population. Muslims and the non-affiliated, are the least likely to select Trump as their candidate of choice. 14% of Muslims and 16% of non-affiliated versus 27% of Jews, 34% of Catholics, 39% of Protestants, etc. In other words, Muslims still are the least likely to select Trump as their president, but support for Trump has actually gone up a little bit, and that's mostly driven by white American Muslims. So with Arab Americans too are generally polling Democratic, though probably less so than Muslim Americans. What's interesting, of course, is that Arab Americans, I think most people know this, but Arab Americans are highly concentrated in battleground states like Michigan. In fact, Joe Biden was just there courting Arab Americans directly in Dearborn this week, though it was Jill Biden and not Joe. And Muslim and Latinx voters are very much in Florida, found very much in Florida. So the Democratic Party ignores them or sidelines them really at their peril. But so if Muslims and Arabs, especially Muslims, since they've been instrumentalized into the political discourse recently, if they have sort of disappeared during the campaign, something else, perhaps partly related, has also largely disappeared, tonight's debate notwithstanding. And that is foreign policy. And I think Shibli was right, that one of the reasons why it could be that the fact that we have a values-oriented election as opposed to a policy-oriented election this time around. But it is a curious absence. And even during the primaries, during the Democratic primaries, there was a somewhat of a discussion around foreign policy, especially with Pete Buttigieg and his service, and with Bernie Sanders is often bringing it up. But nevertheless, there was still very little, I think, compared to in recent years, especially in the early Bush years, George W. Bush. And certainly this time around, we have an election unlike any other. We have the coronavirus epidemic, we have a crashing economy, we have the murder of George Floyd by the police, the global uprisings that ensued to demand an end to systemic racism. All of those have irrevocably changed the course and emphasis of this election. But there already wasn't much discussion of foreign policy, especially of the Middle East North African region. And I would suggest that there are perhaps 3 reasons for this. Despite what we're going to hear tonight, I think Trump actually has very little to brag about. Nothing he has done has changed the calculus of the region. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem, that didn't bring about, peace or the deal of the century as he had promised. Collectively massaging a glowing ball with other autocratic leaders, as they did in Saudi Arabia, didn't change the course of world events either. That's the same can be said with the recent deals announced between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. Leaving the Iran nuclear deal hasn't changed the course of world events. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani hasn't changed the course of world events. There's a lot of stasis, in fact. The number of troops that we have around the world deployed has also remained relatively constant. So that's one. There's not that much for Trump to brag about. 2, Biden has not that many new ideas for foreign policy, especially for the Middle East North Africa region either. In fact, I think goes back mostly to the Obama playbook, which itself also went back to the Bush playbook in a lot of ways. Biden called Trump's provocative move of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem short-sighted and frivolous, for example. But then he said he would leave the embassy in Jerusalem. So I'm not sure what you would call this. This is no change you can believe in, perhaps? I'm not sure. And another reason why there's little emphasis on foreign policy this election is that in some ways the country feels like it itself is self-destructing. Troop deployments, while nowhere near approaching nil as Trump had promised, as I said, remain steady and low. High-profile terrorist attacks in the USA or on American targets haven't been noteworthy in recent years, and that has turned the American gaze inward. And political violence is flaring inside the United States itself. There's fighting on the streets. There's extreme polarization. They're now more, these phenomena that I'm describing are usually considered to be overseas phenomena, and they're now, coming home for a lot of Americans. Foreign policy seems like a distant, even more foreign than usual for American voters. Which brings me to maybe a fourth reason. And that fourth reason is that the US, I think, ultimately is essentially an inward-looking country. Trump's version of isolation and unilateralism has its precedence in the American character. This leads, of course, to some terrible irony. For one thing, American power is all over the world, as we all know. In the words of the great Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, American domination is the only domination from which one never recovers. I mean, from which one never recovers unscarred, Césaire writes. And it's terribly bipartisan, the ways in which American power gets deployed overseas. Al Gore may not have invaded Iraq had he achieved the US presidency, but Barack Obama did not significantly alter the course of the war on terror either. This is not to say that Trump hasn't been specifically harmful as president, even without starting a major international conflagration. The border policies, the children separation policy, the white nationalism, the Muslim ban, all of it harms the prospects of living and thriving in this country. But two more points, if I have a little bit of time before I end. And one is that it would be unfair of me if I didn't also acknowledge that Biden did release on his website programs for both Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. And we can look at them and acknowledge that some of it is very good and that the campaign does know the issues. But when foreign policy has entered the Biden campaign, it has come internally within the Democratic Party and within Arab Muslim communities and led to conflict. A Muslim political action committee called Engage, which has close connections with various pro-Israel groups, as reported by the Electronic Intifada, has caused a rift within Muslim American and Arab American communities. The short form of this story is that Engage has since lost much of its official support within the American Muslim community. And in the early summer, Engage board member Farouk Mitta, who is also described as Joe Biden's senior advisor on Muslim American engagement, hosted a phone call with Palestinian Americans. Several Palestinian Americans later staged a virtual walkout during the meeting after they felt that the Biden campaign wasn't taking their issues seriously and was incorrectly framing the question of Palestine merely as a Muslim issue. So when foreign policy has come up, it has caused actual divisions and rifts and conflicts within the campaign rather than it being visible outside, I would say. Perhaps this is the place to end, a place that acknowledges that even when American foreign policy is basically invisible to the general public, it actually still does have the capacity to destroy, divide, and also conquer. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. And thank you for observing the time. Amazing. I turn now to Suzanne Enzerink, who is a professor at AUB and has done a lot of her research on African Americans and women, gender studies, gender conditions in the United States. So, Suzanne, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen with you all because I did prepare a couple of slides because you don't need to be looking at me for the full 15 minutes. But as Rami said, I will be talking about the role of race and gender in these elections. And of course, if I wanted to go in full detail for that, we would still be here on election day. So what I will do instead is just highlight a couple of developments within the last 4 years surrounding these issues that I think have become important. So I want to begin by just highlighting again how different of a moment we are in today than we were 4 years ago. So 4 years ago, even though it seems like a lifetime ago, Barack Obama was still president, and he was the first Black or biracial president of the United States. And Hillary Clinton was seen as the front runner to become the first female president of the United States. So when it came to issues of gender equality or racial equality, at least symbolically, there was a lot of hope or a lot of promise surrounding actually achieving racial and gender equality within the United States. And this was especially true because the contrast with Hillary Clinton's opponent, now President Donald Trump, was so glaring. So whereas Hillary Clinton explicitly ran on this agenda of "I'm with her," emphasizing the potentially historic nature of becoming the first female president, Trump, in contrast, throughout the election, became known for his sexist and his racist remarks, both during the election, as Mustafa said, where he really espoused anti-Mexican and anti-Muslim rhetoric, but also in his past. And we can see an example, a very famous example of that in the image on the left here. So when election day rolled around, and I know most of you know the statistics, but I just wanted to highlight them again for people who are attending who may be less familiar with this context. When election day rolled around, when you look at who voted for which candidate, race turned out to be the decisive factor in shaping some of these votes. So you can see in the image on the left that all non-white Americans overwhelmingly voted for Hillary Clinton. And as you can see, in the case of African Americans, the majority was over 90%. These were really overwhelming numbers. And when it came to minorities, this was true both for male voters and for female voters. But then when you look at white voters, the image, of course, is a little bit different. White female voters were very much split between Hillary Clinton and between Donald Trump. So even though in the aftermath of Trump's election, women mobilized on a large scale, and this culminated, some of you might remember, in the Women's March, where hundreds of thousands of women marched together in Washington, D.C., in protest against the sexism that Trump stood for in their eyes. The thing that was always looming over such efforts was the fact that 53% of white women had voted for Donald Trump. So whereas race emerged as a pretty stable predictor of voting preferences, gender, especially when it came to white people, turned out not to be such an obvious predictor. And I'm going to overlap a little bit with what Mustafa said here, so I'll go through this quickly. People have debated and continue to debate up until today whether Trump is racist or is sexist. Some people look at what he says and they look at what he tweets and they say, yes, absolutely. Other people look at it and they say, no, he's just not very politically correct. He's very blunt, and some people find this refreshing. He's not part of the political establishment in the same way that some other candidates have been in the past. But no matter how you interpret what Trump says, when you look at the statistics, when you look at the facts, since his election, racist and sexist sentiment and violence resulting from that in the United States have increased significantly. So the FBI has recorded statistics about hate crimes since 1992. So hate crimes are crimes that are committed against someone because of their race, because of their sex, their national origin, their religion, or other protected characteristics. And as Mustafa said, the first pronounced spike in hate crimes came in the direct aftermath of September 11, 2001. The second spike directly correlates with the election of Donald Trump into the White House. So even though his rhetoric has been interpreted differently by people across the political aisle, if you look at actual effects, these are detectable when it comes to statistics. And these hate crimes sometimes took the form of physical violence, but there were also a lot of instances of hate speech that directly equated Americanness with whiteness. So you saw things such as this: "Make America White Again," which of course is a play on Trump's election slogan, "Make America Great Again." A lot of anti-immigrant, a lot of anti-undocumented American rhetoric also was prevalent in the direct aftermath of this election. And this tenor is something that Trump has kind of continued throughout his presidency. There has rarely been a real attempt on his end to condemn these kinds of violence or to speak out against them. In fact, I think if we look at what Trump has done during his presidency, he has kind of doubled down on some of these, you can say racially insensitive, or you can say racist, depending, which perspective you come from. But there have just been countless highly publicized events of Trump saying things that stigmatize people from racial minorities. And of course, this was a very famous example where he called immigrants from predominantly Black majority countries in Africa shithole countries. And the evidence just goes on and on and on. There has been no attempt on his end to counter some of these accusations that he is at heart someone who predominantly represents white Americans. So fast forward to the election campaign. So as some of you may know, in the United States, elections are very drawn out, which is why it feels like this has been going on forever. But Trump started his re-election campaign in July of 2019. So at the time, he singled out 4 progressive Democrat congresswomen for criticism. So he said in his tweets, and I'll just quote from them a little bit, he said, "Progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, now loudly are telling the people of the United States how our government is to be run." So 2 things are going on here. So by juxtaposing them with the people of the United States, he's implicitly suggesting that they do not belong to this group, that they are not American. And by saying originally came from countries, he also suggests that they are, again, not American. So the 4 women he singled out are these 4 women. And what you will notice, of course, is that these are all, not coincidentally, 4 women of color, who, by the way, with the exception of Ilhan Omar, were all born in the United States. So this is just another example of the way in which Trump has used xenophobic and racist language to equate Americanness and who belongs in the United States with whiteness. And then the second very significant and highly publicized movement in his presidency that I briefly want to highlight is the Black Lives Matter movement. So Black Lives Matter has had several resurgences in the United States. They've always been active, but there have been several moments during which they have come into the public eye. And the last was earlier this year in the aftermath of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a number of other Black Americans being killed by mostly white police officers. So protesters said that this was yet another symptom of the way in which the United States remains systematically racist. And not just in terms of violence against people of color, but also in terms of discriminatory housing policies, unequal access to certain benefits. And, as Shibli said today, also in the case of who has access to easy or convenient voting, because a lot of polling stations have been closed in the United States in the last 4 years, making it harder for people, especially in low income and racially diverse areas, to actually cast their vote. So all these developments have only intensified the significance of race and to a lesser extent, of sex when it comes to voting. So even during Black Lives Matter, at the height of it, instead of sort of coming out with a unifying message and saying to people, okay, this is, you know, a real issue that we should address. This is something that is concerning, this persistent violence against Black Americans, etc. He didn't do any of this. Instead, you know, he once again took to Twitter and called Black Lives Matter protesters thugs, which is itself a very racially coded term that sort of again emphasized or communicated to his base, predominantly white Americans, that he was on their side. And Twitter even briefly banned this tweet because of that final part, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, which is also an unprecedented move on part of a president to threaten violence against his own citizens. So all of this culminates into this very basic statistic. Over the past 4 years, voting attitudes when it comes to issues of race and gender have even diverged further between Democrats and Republicans than they were in 2016. So this is a study by the Pew Research Center conducted between July 27 and August 2nd. And as you can see, only 9% of Trump voters thinks that it is more difficult to be a Black person in the United States than a white person. And the same thing goes when it comes to gender equality. Only 26% of them thinks that it is harder for a woman to experience social mobility than it is for men. And this stands in stark contrast with what Biden voters think, who do readily accept that, you know, there are certain structural barriers that Americans of color face and that women face when it comes to issues of social mobility in the United States. And I just want to end by this, and Rami, if I'm out of time, let me know. The elections matter. The elections matter a lot, as both of my wonderful fellow panelists have said. It really, at this point, is a question of democracy, and can the illusion of democracy in the United States continue to exist based on what happens on November 3rd. But even if Joe Biden is elected on November 3rd, there are a couple of things that have happened in the last 4 years that have already significantly impacted gender-based and race-based protections and liberties in the United States. So the first thing I want to highlight, and then I'll end there, is that Trump very recently, and again leading up to the elections, doubled down even further on any attempt to organize or any attempt to combat structural racism and sexism in the United States. So he released an executive order titled "On Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping." But when you look at the text of this executive order, what it's intended to do is to prevent Americans of color from accusing white Americans of racism. So he sort of says, actually, in this current climate of Black Lives Matter, it's been white Americans who have been discriminated against, and this has to be put to a stop. So the target of this executive order is diversity and inclusion training by federal contractors. What it means in practice is that no such training can mention terms such as white privilege, sexism, bias, etc. So how can you begin to tackle these issues of racism and sexism if you are not allowed to use the language that identifies them? And all sorts of institutions are impacted by this. It goes from education to corporations that receive $10K in federal funding. And the effects of this are that a lot of diversity and inclusion trainings are being canceled. So here are just a couple of headlines. The Department of Justice had to cancel a women's leadership conference. Corporate diversity trainings, anti-racism workshops are canceled. A meeting for LGBT federal workers, again, canceled. A critical race theory training at the Center for Disease Control, canceled. So again, all of this is part of this larger effort on part of the Trump administration to not, to not necessarily double down on race and gender discrimination, but to really communicate to the base, okay, I understand that you have certain concerns surrounding this, and I'm really here for you. And you, in this case, predominantly means white American men. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thanks to the three speakers for an extraordinarily rich analysis of many different dimensions. We've got a couple of questions coming in. Let me ask the first one, and this is for all three of you, if you each want to say, if the emphasis is so clearly on identity issues, where would identity and policy overlap really clearly? So when somebody goes to vote, they're not only showing their identity, but they're supporting a certain policy. Do you want to comment, Shibli, to start on that?
Sure. This is really a big debate in American politics about sort of what is the identity issue in America. I have a colleague, Liliana Mason, who has a very important book this year about kind of the emergence of partisan identity in America as a principal identity for people defining themselves. The question is, when I'm not. There's some evidence, indicating that it's principally partisanship, but there's other evidence that suggests otherwise. For example, I do studies of identity. I ask people how they identify themselves, and I have, and I've been tracing that since before 2016. I've been doing it in the past 4 years, and one of the questions is whether they identify themselves as Americans first, as by their religion, as citizen of the world, by their ethnicity, by their gender. We go through a whole host of things. And what's fascinating is that American identity as such actually has declined in Trump's time, despite the America First label. Obviously, we know the reaction to Trump that obviously generated and obviously a majority of people oppose him, as you could see in the polling. But even among Republicans, there has been a slight decline in American identity. So that's interesting. And the reason for it is very obvious that in the case of overall population, just the rallying behind what we think of as American values, egalitarianism, equality, freedom for all, has actually increased the sense of global identity for Americans. And we see that particularly among young people, but certainly true for Democrats overall, it increased. Among Republicans, there was a rise in religious identity, people who identify by their religion first. So to the extent that there is a values associated with the identities that people are expressing, I think it's more, those who oppose Trump rallying on around what we typically think of as American values, clearly intensified. But I don't want to underestimate, and that's where the big debate is, about the rise of white supremacy packed into what Trump is doing. And obviously all this stuff related to conspiracy theories that we have coming wrapped into that now with the QAnon and some outlandish groups. There's a big debate about that. I happen to think, personally, based on polling that we have done, that actually there is no expansion of white supremacy in America. I happen to think that there's an energizing of white supremacy in America. The numbers are not expanding. It's just that those who are there are being energized, they're being empowered by the president to speak out, to act, and we hear their noises far more than we have in the past. Just to kind of reinforce that, and particularly to reinforce what Mustafa said, as you know, I have been doing also polling about American attitudes toward Islam and Muslims. And I started before Trump came into office and continued throughout the period after Trump. And Trump made Americans like Muslims. In fact, really every single poll that we have done The next poll had Americans like Muslims more than they did before, even after things were attributed to them, such as the Orlando horror and other events that have taken place that were associated with Muslims, and Trump tried to essentially blame Muslims for them, and yet it was exactly the opposite. Not because, of course, suddenly people are discovering Muslims are good people, but it just, if Trump dislikes them, then they must be good, kind of thing. And so he's had it kind of the opposite impact on a large majority of people. So most of the people who've changed their attitudes have been Democrats and independents. Republicans haven't shifted much on that. But that I think we all are going to have to reflect on. It's a really complicated issue to think about. Sort of what is the identity divide here that is animating what we're facing. I don't think it's just an identity divide. I think you could see that because of the Republicans who are abandoning the president. I think it's sort of the traditional American values that in the past have transcended even a Republican-Democratic divide. And you can even see it, you ask yourself, why do members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, support this president? When you hear them talk privately, or we heard them talk about him before, you know that they don't agree with his values. You know that they don't agree with what he stands for. You know this is not the identity they want to project for themselves. They're doing it uncomfortably, but they're doing it because he's been able to get the base against them if they go against him, and they're doing it because he's getting them things they want, like the Supreme Court. Those are huge issues that they fought for. So there's an issue where the support for him isn't necessarily all wrapped in a sense of identity, but in a sense of expediency.
Mustafa, do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I think, sure. I can point to, I think, two specific policy questions and that are related to identity. And one for Muslims and one for Arabs. And the one for Muslims would be the ending the Muslim ban, right? The Muslim ban itself is deeply unpopular. It is itself, I don't think it's not the same. Obviously, it's not the same kind of family separation policy that we see at the southern border of the country, but it has turned out to be also a kind of family separation policy. It's harmful to Muslim communities within the country. It's harming a lot of Iranian Americans mostly, and Yemeni Americans as well. So, in fact, Joe Biden has repeatedly said that on the first day that he comes into office, that he will then get rid of the Muslim ban. So that, I think, is directly a direct policy issue that relates. Similarly, one of the things that that Trump did also do relates to the census. And the census during the Obama years, but this had been long in the works, that the census had recommended the creation of a new census category and different ways of thinking about the racial and ethnic formulation of the country. And so there was going to be a new category that would have been part of this year's census, and that would have been the category of Middle East North African. As I'm sure people know, now people from the Middle East are just slotted into the white box, which is deeply uncomfortable and just wrong on so many levels for people from the Middle Eastern region. And so the creation of this new category was scuttled by the Trump administration. And in fact, they've done everything they can to undermine the census written large. And so I think that the census is, of course, very, very important, not just as an identity question, but also as the way that resources get redistributed in the country. Also for the creation of a new category that would mean that recognition, in fact, as well. So political recognition is a very important element of politics as well. And so I think the creation of the census, something else that the Biden campaign has said on to Arab Americans, was that they would then reinstitute the MENA category in the census. So I think we have two very specific elements here that relate to the election. Lastly, I would say I agree with everything that Shibli is saying, but what I think is that it's not that white supremacy is, my impression too, is not that white supremacy is enlarging, but that it is it has the White House, and it has the opportunity to have a megaphone and to, in fact, affect policy. And that, so in that way, Stephen Miller is, of course, a key architect for all of this. And what motivates people like Stephen Miller is the specter of the year 2044 looming around, right? And because that's the year, around that year anyways, when demographers suggest that the country will become, in fact, majority minority, right? So that the white people will not be the majority in the country anymore. And that's really going to alter and shift the ways in which a lot of Americans typically have thought about themselves and their relationship to the country. What that's exactly going to mean, no one really knows. But it does mean that whiteness as the sort of defining category of Americanness is going to change. So in a lot of ways, I think that this is the last expression of this version of the Republican Party that is based on this sort of white supremacist idea. I'm hoping that this is true. I think that this feels like a swan song to me, that even the Republicans, if they want to have a future in politics in this country, they're going to have to acknowledge the multicultural fabric of the country as well.
Thank you, Mustafa. Suzanne, did you have any comments on those?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I agree with what both other panelists said as well, of course. I do briefly want to bring up the issue of the Supreme Court again. It was interesting to me that Shibli said that only a very limited number of voters has been thinking about the Supreme Court when it comes to deciding who they will vote for, because Trump has already had the opportunity to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices, and currently the confirmation process for a 3rd justice is ongoing. So the balance of the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land, its opinions are decisive. The balance is really shifting from a court that was made up roughly equally out of justices who lean liberally and conservatively to a 6-3 majority for justices who lean conservatively. Why does that matter when it comes to identity in terms of voting? The Supreme Court often decides on certain protections for groups that are identified as minorities. So the seat that is currently being filled, the seat of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was one of the foundational figures in legally enshrining gender equality within the United States, filling her Supreme Court with someone very conservative. So the candidate, Amy Coney Barrett, is someone who is anti-affirmative action. She is anti-abortion, and a whole range of other, race and gender-based protections that could come under attack if she is confirmed on the Supreme Court. So I think in this way, I wish that the Supreme Court loomed larger on people's minds when they were determining their vote, because Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. So who is appointed now could be on there for 3 decades and significantly shape policy much longer than someone like Trump could ever be in office. And secondly, as I said, as you saw on the statistics from 2016 and other years, racial minorities have always voted overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. So I think right now the question is, for white Americans, is my Republican leaning, does that justify implicitly endorsing the kinds of racist, sexist policies that Trump stands for? So, we see some Republicans, such as Mitch Romney, who have chosen country over party. Mitch Romney did not vote for Donald Trump. But it's a question that, every white American will have to answer for themselves. Do some of my views on immigration, etc., is that important enough for me to give Trump another 4-year mandate to carry on some of the policies that he has been implementing, which, as I said during my 15 minutes, I think are, incontrovertibly racist and sexist.
Let me clarify, if you don't mind, let me just clarify what the polls say on the Supreme Court, because
Yes,
I think
please.
there may have been a misunderstanding. So when we ask them specifically about the Supreme Court as a question, if we have a list of questions, and we did in the recent election, how important is the Supreme Court for your vote? A large majority say it's very important, on a scale of, not important at all, a little, somewhat important, very important. The majority say it's very important. And it ranks above a lot of other issues in that scaling. Where it is less important is actually in when you package it, because we put it in there because we know it's important. So we said, all right, so let's compare this, let's say, to party loyalty, whether or not they agree with the candidates, and whether they're voting for or against Trump. How does that fare in that mix? Party loyalty, few people said that, surprisingly, because it's also important. But also few people said Supreme Court, because the vast majority said, I'm voting for Trump or against Trump. Because that, of course, it already packs the Supreme Court into it, right? It's not like it's completely divorced from it, because when you're voting against Trump, you're voting against some of the issues that have alienated you about him, and that includes the Supreme Court. So it's not, it's not the Supreme Court is not important. We put it in there because it's one of the most important, if not the most important actual issues. So it should be clarified that this is just that the attitudes toward Trump is overwhelming even the specific attitude about the Supreme Court, because that's really what's animating people when they go into the polls.
Thank you, Shabli. We have a question from Iman Qaisi. It's quite long. I'll summarize it. It's for Mustafa. And essentially, she's saying, according to an article that came out in Detroit in one of the Arab American publications, it quotes polls saying that Shiites from the Middle East who have come to the United States and have become American citizens or are in the process are voting for Trump. They say they prefer Trump mainly because of his economic policies. And they say, we left Lebanon, we left other Arab countries because the situation was bad, and we are less interested in what goes on back there, and we're more interested in our status as Americans, especially our economic well-being. Can you comment on that from your research?
Well, first of all, I have not seen that. And let me just say, it's very difficult to have reliable polling among Arab Americans. As you know, they weren't in the census. And so, you're just doing some sampling in major cities where they're concentrated. It's better than guessing, I guess. And you do know that Arab Americans are diverse. And on some issues, they're really far apart because they're depending on which country they're coming from, which region they're coming from. So that somebody did a poll among the few who are Shia in America is puzzling to me. And I'm not sure whether that's Shia that includes Arab Shia only or Muslim Shia. As you know, probably Muslims far outnumber Arabs in America. Non-Arab Muslims far outnumber Arabs in America. And if you're looking at the Shia, the Muslim Shia in America, I would bet that most of them are not Arab. So Lebanon is not even featured in that. If this is really Arab Shia, then it's a very small number anyway. And probably, I would assume it includes a lot of Iraqis, even more than Lebanese. And I would doubt that anybody has designed a really scientific poll among that small group that could tell us something. So I'd be interested to see it. But I would have, I would doubt that it is what you reported, Rami, as you reported.
To clarify from the question, it's from a poll of Lebanese Shiites that was published in an article in Asas Media by Ibrahim Rihan. So we can check that out. But Mustafa, what's your sense about that?
Likewise, I'd have to see the evidence before I could really judge it. I'm not familiar with that finding, and nor am I familiar with the tendency of that finding. Things are possible. I'm not saying that it's wrong, right or wrong. I'd have to be able to judge it first before coming to a conclusion. I would also say that I think the question says that the economic policies is the primary motivation for voting for Trump. Well, even that, then we'll have to see when was that even taken, because the economy has basically collapsed around so many people in this country. And that has also, I think, had an effect on Trump's voting base. And also, I find it puzzling that there would be this comment in the question regarding the fact that people have left back home behind, right? So that they're not interested in Lebanon anymore, and that was based in the question, because that doesn't track with most Arab Americans, at least that I'm familiar with, and certainly it's true that Trump does have some support within the broader Middle East American community. For example, what I have read that among Chaldean Americans, for example, there's quite significant support for Trump, and that has a lot to do with his support for religious freedom and religious persecution around the world. And so many Christian communities within the Arab world think that Trump has their back for that reason. And so yes, but that in fact indicates that there's even a closer connection with the politics of back home and the politics of this country. So there are many, actually, I find many confusing elements to the question. It's not that I would say that I would necessarily say no out of hand, but I would really have to do a lot more research before I could pass judgment.
Mm-hmm. Another question is about the impact of the progressive movement, especially young women of color, but also men of color who've been winning Democratic primaries all around the country. And obviously there's a whole new element there in electoral politics that is linked to gender, linked to race, and linked to progressive politics. We saw it in the 2016 congressional and by-elections, and now it may happen again. If any of you want to, starting with Suzanne, talk about your sense of the impact. Is there a lasting impact of what seems to be a very strong movement for progressive politics to win elections or primaries, and will they impact the Democratic Party's policies if Biden wins?
I mean, I would think so. I think what is so fascinating about this new generation of congressmen and congresswomen, of candidates at the state level and the local level, is the extent to which they have embraced new media to reach an entirely new voting base that otherwise has been hard to galvanize. So I think it was yesterday or the day before, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held a Twitch stream, which basically broke the app. It broke all records for usage of that app. And the majority of the people that she draws in events like that, and she also regularly uses Instagram stories, she uses Facebook, she uses Twitter. It's an entirely new way to be interactive with voters using media platforms that they're already used to and accustomed to. And it requires delivering information to them in an entirely new way in these short little bursts rather than, someone sitting down and watching a full debate. But I think that they've been very clever in doing that. And it's not just her, it's also, as you said, across the country and at different levels, a new generation of young politicians who really have made social equality the center of their platform. And I think, you can see by the success that they're having that this is something that is here to stay.
Mustafa Shibli, any comments on the
program? Just to say that, there's no question that Black women are running in larger numbers. There's actually an article about this recently. Notable increase in the number of African American women who are running for office. Now that's not surprising because we have seen in the past few years really an increased number of women, period, who are active, who are becoming more active in politics. And we have, in fact, after this event, I'm hosting a speaker here, a colleague of mine, Antoine Banks, who has an article that we're discussing at my forum on the activation of African Americans, and especially when they become angry. And when you combine being a woman and being African American in this environment, you could see how anger is going to motivate you to be out there. The problem is that they've been having a tough time mobilizing resources. So while there are a lot of them out there, they're vying for resources in a tight environment, and they're having disadvantages with that. That's one of the things that obviously how important money is in politics. And by the way, one reason Democrats are doing well, particularly in red states, is that they have raised an amazing amount of money, not just Biden, but even senatorial races that Republican candidates are typically able to raise more money. They're being outraised, not just from big money that's coming in, but also from small donations of very energized political base. We haven't seen that as much when it comes to African American women candidates.
But if I can interject, the experience of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, with their very progressive, even very left policies, they raised huge amounts of money from millions of people around the country.
Yes, and Obama too, by the way. I mean, Obama obviously, and he in some ways he started that, because as you know, Hillary Clinton has such a huge advantage of big money, and she was the favorite when he ran. That was the asset, that he actually mobilized all kinds of small supporters, and obviously Bernie Sanders did the same. And still we're seeing that with regard to many of the Democratic candidates, but for some reason that hasn't, that women, African-American women candidates have had a tougher time getting resources.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. Khalid Fendi has a question. He asks if anybody maybe would like to answer it. Would we see economic détente in Lebanon and the region if Biden wins the election? Mustafa, do you want to take that one? Unmute. Yeah.
All right, yes. Economic détente, I'm not sure exactly what that refers to. Although
probably reducing sanctions and resuming aid to different places where it was cut off, maybe.
Okay, yeah. In that case, I would say I think the answer is probably going to be yes. I mean, if you look at Joe Biden's, of course, it depends on how much we can take them at their word, which is true for any politician. But the Biden campaign's website, in fact, lists support for Lebanon in all kinds of ways directly, which is I think a welcome change in American politics, rather than, I think one of the real problems in American politics especially during the war on terror, and even more so during the Trump years, where Iran has become vilified to the degree that it is vilified, is that Lebanon is really seen in the Trump version of world affairs as basically a satellite of Lebanon, of Iran, which, as everybody here knows, is incorrect on so many levels, and damaging to the region as well. And so bringing just some reality and some sanity into discussions on that level would be more than welcome. Yeah.
We have one last question, because we promised to finish in an hour and a half. And this is a broad question which I'd like to pose to all of you. Based on what you've said, and it's all based on serious research and strong analysis, the identity issues, the values issues are very strong, but they seem to me, as a journalist predominantly who covered these issues for the last 50 years, since I was a college student in the United States in the late 1960s. And ever since then, I've followed these issues, particularly with Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, African Americans, and now increasingly I'm focusing on learning more about the Hispanic community, which seems to me the kind of forgotten community, because they're really a large number. But anyway, the point is, when you go deeper into the reasons why people vote, or what they feel, it often seems to get back to bread and butter issues: education, housing, jobs, social security, medical care, practical family issues, which is normal. So is it really that identity and values are becoming more powerful, or is it that identity and values are simply a new way to express the old adage that it's the economy, stupid? Is it really only the economy in the final analysis? We'll go backwards. We'll start with Suzanne.
Okay. I think that's a very good question, and that question of economic positionality has come up a lot, especially when people try to unpack, how it happened that Trump won in 2016. But I think, the issue is you cannot uncouple economic status from issues such as race and gender. It's all intersectional. They enhance each other. It's simply a reality that when you look at who is socioeconomically disadvantaged, that group includes a lot of racial minorities, both Hispanics, African Americans, other racial groups within the United States. So I think, Trump may have put the issue of identity when it comes to actual rhetoric on the agenda more, but I think, race and economic status simply cannot be unpacked from each other. And I think, as you say, when people focus on bread and butter issues, you cannot disentangle that from policies that have discriminated against racial minority groups. In terms of economics, you only have to look at Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's recent book on discriminatory housing policies in the United States that have unfairly affected who gets to live where, who can buy a house, who can build up equity in the form of a house, etc. And when you break it down again, it all correlates with racial identity. So I don't think you can separate them enough to only bring it back to that economic element. Thank you.
Mustafa.
I think I might take issue with the question, Rami.
That's fantastic. I wanted to thank you, but you only have a minute and a half.
Well, I mean, even ever since Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? I think we've seen that bread and butter issues actually sometimes do take second place to identity issues. People vote against their own economic interests in this country, and they've been doing so for decades, frankly. Why would that be the case? Well, there's a lot of ideology in this country that comes through in very destructive ways. And that's primarily true, I think, for the majority the population in the country. That's, of course, white Americans at this point. And it's, so it would, and sometimes, as Susanna's indicating, there's a way in which sometimes that is actually used. There's the idea that people were voting, that it was economic anxiety, not racism, that motivated people to vote for Trump. And I think that's just another way of not addressing what the real question is. And so I think that would be a really rational system if people voted on bread and butter issues. But actually, I think in the United States, there's a long and powerful line of people not voting along their economic interests.
Thank you. Shibli.
I think what Mustafa said is true. I mean, they're often, it's puzzling sometimes how people vote when you analyze their interest, and they embrace a certain sense of identity, even when it comes at the expense of the rational analysis of their interest. But I want to say, I am, as somebody who does kind of empirical analysis of what takes place, I wonder, let's assume that Trump had been able to handle the pandemic really well and stop it and end it, better than anybody else in the world. And we're really like New Zealand now, we're gathering with no fear. And let's assume that the economy is really going through the roof by now for most segments, that it's really strong. Would the American public have, put aside, what they dislike about him, what he stands for, his corruption, his threatening of American institution, a sense of he's threatening the democratic institutions? I am not entirely sure that may not be the case. I mean, that is, and under certain circumstances, I think we have examples of this. If you look at somebody like James Baker, who is highly respected not only among Republicans, but many of the centrists in Washington, the former Secretary of State. They see him as a sensible, rational man who has been very pragmatic on foreign policy and also sometimes worked with Democrats very closely. And he was interviewed recently and said, I'm still supporting Trump, even though I don't like a lot of what he does, because I agree. I like some of the results that he brought from his own perspective, Baker's own perspective. So I think there are a lot of people like that. But the reality of it is you can't unpack this because of who Trump is, we have the results we have. Because the guy is in the hands of, he's very vulnerable to being used. He doesn't follow facts. He doesn't understand issues. He's manipulated. You're bound to have the results that you have. And so it's all packed together in this particular case. It's really hard to separate.
Thank you. On that note, we have to bring this to a close, and we have the election coming up, and some of these questions may be answered, but we're fortunate to have scholars and colleagues like yourselves and institutes like Essam Faris and centers like CASAR and initiatives like the Global Engagement and AUB in New York, the DEP Center, to help us, figure out this stuff and keep analyzing it and learning about our world. In the meantime, I thank you all, and I thank the people who helped put this together, Joseph and all the people in Beirut. And the closing word to Joseph. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Rami. I just want to thank all of you. I think very frankly that it was a tremendous discussion, very novel in the way it has approached things. I think we've heard certain findings for the first time. I won't go back to the discussion, but I learned a lot. I think our public learned a lot, and this is exactly what we aim to do and what we have to do in institutions like ours. Rami, I can't thank you enough for this partnership with you personally, and because you were very helpful in putting up this event, and with the center you are now in charge of in New York. And I hope that this will be the beacon of many other collaborations. I thank Shibli Talhami a lot, Suzanne very much, which I hope to see at the AUB soon, and Mustafa Bayouni, whom I would really look forward to meeting soon as we can. A big thanks also for the team here at IFI, Suzanne Husari, who's now behind the screen, managing this event, and for other colleagues here at IFI who were, I think, very thrilled by preparing that and hearing you all. I thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon on other events. As I said, there will be a part 2 of this one after elections on Middle Eastern trends of the new administration. I hope you'll be online this day too. Thank you very much, and good evening for us here in Beirut.
And last note, there's a surprise coming up on October 30 that we're going to do from the Global Engagement Office in New York in collaboration with the Theater Initiative at AUB. And I will not give you the details, but it's going to be something exciting, different, educational, entertaining, captivating, and linked to some of these issues we're talking about and the election. And we're doing it October 30, just before the election, but we will send out information on that once we finalize it in the coming few days. Thanks again, and good day to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.